So Franco, before the break, you were doing an excellent job of explaining a little bit of what a wealth tax is, where it's been implemented. But let's talk more importantly what the Parliamentary Budget Office and its officer had to say about it. It suggests that the wealth tax, as you mentioned, wouldn't even cover the gap in the budget. So why even bother with something like this?
Yeah, well, not even close, right? And not only would it not cover the gap in the budget, I mean, like I said, it's going to impose some damage to our economy at the worst possible time. So what the Parliamentary Budget Officer found is that this could bring in about $60 billion over 5 years, right? I kind of broke that down. Trudeau would burn through that spending with his deficit spending in about a month. But over 5 years, to underscore just how big the deficit problem is in Canada, even if we had this damaging wealth tax, the budget gap would still be over $270 billion over those 5 years. And you know, the government does need to take the debt problem seriously, but it needs to do that by reining in years of overspending.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that this potential or proposed rather wealth tax wouldn't even do anything. In fact, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, he actually balked at the idea of a wealth tax and suggested this one-time tax ought to really be an ongoing tax on the ultra-rich. Is he an outlier here amongst politicians?
Well, I think that's what taxpayers really need to be on guard here, right? It's that slippery slope of taxation. You know, you hear a one-time tax and you should almost laugh at it, right? Like, I'm going to have just one bite of cheesecake after dinner. Come on, right? And just let's look throughout history. Remember, the income tax was introduced in 1917 to deal with the government's war spending of World War I. Well, World War I is long gone, thankfully, and we still have an income tax. So we just have to remember that whenever we're talking about taxation, is that slippery slope. And one more point on that. So I mentioned that France had its wealth tax. Well, eventually, over time, they started trapping in more taxpayers under the wealth tax as they stopped moving the threshold with inflation. So we just have to remember the slippery slope of taxation here.
Okay, that's actually a very interesting point you just brought up, because I do recall the France case, and I do recall that many, to use the expression of Jagmeet Singh, ultra-rich, found tax shelters elsewhere or vacated the country so that they wouldn't have to pay this new tax that France had implemented. But you're suggesting now that the window for taxation actually shifted more to capture more of the middle class?
Yeah. So how the wealth tax work is essentially you have a threshold, right? And if you make above that threshold, you get hit with the tax. And the threshold initially would move every year with inflation. Well, eventually the French government, I guess they wanted more money. They stopped moving that threshold with inflation, and more taxpayers would get bumped into paying that wealth tax as their property values rose.
Okay, I understand. I think I can see where potential problems might lie if something like this were implemented. However, on the flip side, you know, Canadians, we are a generous lot, and many don't mind opening up their wallets and paying a little bit extra if they're going to have a good program, and especially during the times of COVID lockdowns. I mean, there might be lockdown fatigue now, but especially in the early months, I think people really thought we had to, you know, the government had to step in there and do something, and businesses were very grateful for that. Now those chickens are coming home to roost, in a sense that we're now getting the bill, and we're finding that there's a big gap there in terms of what we can afford and what we have. What is the solution here? You know, it sounds like CERB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, is winding down. CEWS, I assume so as well. Could this potentially actually really just be temporary? Meaning, once we get over this hump that COVID dealt us, that we could actually be back where we should be in good fiscal footing?
Well, taxpayers are already paying our fair share. We're already paying a lot. Businesses are already paying their fair share. They're already paying a lot, right? When is it time for politicians in government really to start paying their fair share? Now, let's remember here, we are not talking about a federal budget that is cut to the bone. We are talking about a lot of fat on that government stake in Ottawa, right? Our members of parliament have received not one, but two pay raises while millions of Canadians struggled through COVID-19. That is a slap in the face to so many taxpayers, so many private sector workers who took huge pay cuts, who maybe lost their job. What about all the small business owners who had to hand out those pink slips, or who saw the revenue evaporate before their very eyes? I mean, quite frankly, Canadian taxpayers, we have been paying our fair share. It's really time for government to rein in the spending and to tighten the belt. You know, I talk about the MP pay raises, two of them during COVID-19? Well, let's look at the jobs numbers.